Hi guys, in today's episode we'll be looking at the M1 MacBook Pro and comparing it to the 16-inch MacBook Pro and the 13-inch Intel one and also the 2019 iMac as well. I've souped up all of them and I'll give you the specs here as well. Now before I continue, I just wanted to say the purpose of this video is to have a bit of a different look, because I've looked online and I feel like a lot of people are just over the top praising the M1 MacBook Pro. Everyone, there's nothing negative about it, absolutely no one saying anything. So this is not my complete review, it's just a look at a few things that I have found and I'm just interested in. So let's get this ball rolling. So first things first, I'd like to look at a iMac. So this iMac is a 2019 iMac. It's got an i9 processor in there. It's got 8 gigs of RAM, which is more than enough for what we're doing, because Mac does that thing where it writes on the internal hard drive. And it's got a 128 internal solid state hard drive with a fusion drive, with a 2 terabyte fusion drive. It's also got a GPU, RX580, and in this test we're just exporting a 15-second HEVC clip, which is the most common one, and it does HDR with 10-bit, and this is HDR 10-bit, and it took me 5 minutes, 20 seconds and 20 milliseconds. Now let's get into the next one, which is the MacBook Pro 16-inch 2019 one, which is the latest one at the moment. It's been upgraded to the i9 2.3 gigahertz with 16 gigs of RAM, 5500M 4 gigabyte GPU, and it's also exporting, all of these are exporting the exact same clip. The clip has a lot of other things on it as well, so I've obviously sped it up. So the clip has a lot of things that push the boundary. So I've put texts and a lot of stuff happening and effects and things like that, and color correction as well. So let's see how we go with this test. So as you can appreciate, this MacBook has the exact same processor as the iMac. However, that's a desktop class processor with better cooling. So let's see what difference that makes. Okay, so the export time is nearly doubled, which is 9 minutes 3 seconds and 9 milliseconds. All right, next up, this is a very expensive souped up MacBook Pro, the 2020 version, and it's souped up to the highest quad-core i7 processor, 2.3 gigahertz, and it has 32 gigs of RAM. What you guys don't know, it's also got 2 terabytes of solid state hard drive. It has an Intel Iris processor, and again the same HEVC export. And I think from what I can tell is, so those two computers before, the iMac and the MacBook Pro, they have a processor that is hyper threads up to 16. This only hyper threads up to 8. So it'll be understandable if it's, however, it's a bit newer. So let's see if this is a lot slower than that. So this is a 10th gen processor. This is the i7, whereas those two had the 9th gen i9 in there. So let's see how this one does with the test. It's nearly done. Okay, so 11:29:04, which is not too bad compared to the i9 in the other laptop, which is just 2 minutes slower. Now, this is the interesting one. So we're exporting the same exact clip on the MacBook Pro 13-inch, the 2020 M1 that everyone is talking about. It's got a 3.2 gigahertz processor, the M1 CPU. It's got 8 gigs of RAM integrated and a octa-core M1 GPU. All of them are on one chip, and it's doing this export as well. So understandably, Apple wants this to succeed, and it's really optimized Final Cut. So all of these tests are in Final Cut. Okay, so there you go. 5 minutes and 5 seconds and 12 milliseconds. Now, what I would like to state that is the reason I'm testing all of this out in Final Cut is for a simple fact that if you're getting for me, if you're getting a MacBook and you're using, I would guess you'd be interested in using Mac products. So there's no point in getting a MacBook and using Office on it. You've got Pages, Numbers, and Keynote. If you've got a MacBook, you're not going to put DaVinci Resolve or Photoshop and stuff like that. You're going to use Final Cut. If you're going to use the rest like Office, I'm not dissing them or in any way, but if you're going to use them, there's a lot better and cheaper way of doing it. Buy a Windows laptop. There's really good Windows laptops. Razer, Asus make really good laptops, and also you can build yourself a beast of a computer, so without getting into too much of that, so I specifically wanted to look at video editing because a lot of people are talking about how this is great and how they've replaced they're regretting buying an iMac that was released 2-3 months ago. So I'm going to basically look at that and see if there's a bit more in there. All right, let's get the next test started. Now the next lot of tests will be H.264 with the internal graphics and an external graphics. So this one's the iMac again. So it's with the internal graphic 15-second H.264 export and seeing how long it takes to do that. Okay, so there you have it. The export time for that is 1 minute 20 seconds and 21 milliseconds. Okay, so all of a sudden a lot more improvement, and I'll go into why you're seeing such an improvement in H.264 okay in a second. All right, so let's get the next test started. So this is the MacBook Pro 16-inch, and again it's got the 5500M with 4 gigs of memory VRAM. Now this exported it in a record 48 seconds and 10 milliseconds, which is quite fast. Now let's get into the next test, which is the MacBook Pro, and this is connected to the external eGPU, which is the 5500 XT, which is what I've done for all of them, and this does it at a record 1 minute and 15 seconds and 37 seconds, so quite a bit slow. Now going on to the next, we're going to be looking at the Intel 2020 souped up nearly $5,000 MacBook Pro 13-inch with quad-core i7, and it's got 32 gigs of RAM, so it's a really powerful laptop, and that took 1 minute and 15 seconds and 49 milliseconds. So that's with the Intel Iris inside. Now let's see if it gives us an improvement with the eGPU setup, and there you go. So 1 minute and 18 seconds and 14 milliseconds. Okay, so lastly we're looking at the MacBook Pro 13-inch with the M1 processor, and that just does it at 55 seconds and 1 millisecond. And now that's a real improvement. I understand that. I'm not taking anything away from it, and the only reason that doesn't have an eGPU connected to it, because at this time Macs aren't, with the new Apple chip, Macs aren't allowed to use a eGPU. All right, let's move on to something that I'd like to show you guys in regards to this. All right, so this is just 2 tests being done side by side. The 13-inch MacBook Pro with the Intel on the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the Intel processor on the right, and the M1 MacBook Pro on the left. Now, if you guys look at the GPU usage, which is the blue spikes in the middle, that's quite high. It's really pushing it, and it's really using it. Okay, and I'm telling you honestly, like this is HEVC export, and if you look at the MacBook Pro 16-inch, the hyper-threading cores aren't really used properly. Okay. Also, another thing, if you look at the RAMs are at 12 gigs, around 12, and they're not being swapped. So they're not using the SSD inside to improve it and make it faster, whereas the M1 it's using that to really push it. So it's a lot better integrated. It's optimized is I think is the proper word, because it's one thing to say it's efficient, okay, so which I'm not saying it's not, but it's another thing to say it's optimized, okay. So the MacBook Pro 16-inch, as you can see, is not really optimized with Final Cut. If you look at the GPU usage, both the internal and external, they're hardly being used. I've also tested them with the external GPU, and when I connect the external GPU, they just stop working. All of the core, it just stops working completely, and it's really slows the MacBook Pro down. Now, the problem I have with that is the M1 has only been out for a month, okay? So Apple has had a month worth of time to play around and optimize Final Cut to the M1 MacBook Pro. The MacBook Pro 16-inch with that processor has been out for over a year now. Apple has had over a year to play around with it and optimize Final Cut. I don't care if Intel owns it and AMD owns the GPU. It's an Apple computer. Apple puts those parts in there. Apple chooses the parts, what you get. You can't swap them out. You can't change anything. They control everything. So they should at least optimize it to be able to take advantage of this hyper-threading cores and also the GPU properly. Okay, which is not. It's complete. As you can see, facts right there, right in front of you. It's not using the GPU, or it wouldn't use the eGPU either. So the problem I'm having with that is it's your product, Apple. So it feels like almost Apple is going out of their way to make the M1 look really good. Because if you realistically look at, let's say, DaVinci Resolve and things like that, the MacBook Pro 16-inch would beat it. Would beat the M1, okay, but it's not beating it here. It's not beating it at Final Cut. Now, if we go back, and I think off the top of my head, the version of Final Cut that we're using at the moment is Final Cut 10.5, which is the latest one that you get when you update to Big Sur or Catalina. But if you had, off the top of my head, 10.4.5, back then it had enabled GPU usage for HEVC exports. So after that update, after when they updated it to, I think, 10.4.6, you couldn't use it any longer. It would solely rely on your CPU, which is what you see in the activity monitor there. Now, if you look at the 8 cores, they're completely being used. The hyper-threading cores aren't being used. So, you know, you've got the solid state hard drive, you've got 16 gig of RAMs and things like that. It's not utilizing it properly at all. So that's my real gripe with it. That's all I wanted to say about this. I won't get into too much about it. So don't go too crazy yet. Wait for, I've got a few things coming up, personal life, and hopefully I will give this MacBook Pro with the M1 a really good run for its money. I'll be checking it a lot and keeping an eye on it, both from an Apple fan and someone who's getting tired of Apple's BS. So I'll be looking at it from both a fan who's an Apple fanboy and a person who's just getting over Apple at the moment. So I'll be looking at it from both angles, and I will be doing a full and complete review in about 2 weeks from now. All right, guys, thank you for watching, and that's the end of it. If you aren't subscribed, please do subscribe, give it a like, and follow us on Patreon as well, and support us to see more content. Thank you. Bye.